The monitor crackled. That was the first thing. Not the wind against the shutters, not the distant howl of something moving through the brush. Just the crackle, sharp and wet, like static finding a throat. Naomi Vance had not moved from her chair in 40 minutes. The old barn monitor sat on the corner of the kitchen table, the way it had every night for 3 years, its green light pulsing like a sleeping heart. She knew every sound that place made. The rustle of the 2 remaining horses. The slow drip from the roof gutter that she kept meaning to fix. The way the desert wind dragged itself across the corrugated roof with the patience of something that had all the time in the world. She did not know this sound. It was low, almost nothing. A trembling at the edge of perception, the kind of sound that made you stop breathing before your brain had time to explain why. Then it came again, and this time there was no mistaking it. A child was crying outside her fence. Alone, in the dark, at midnight. Naomi's hand was already on the flashlight before her chair scraped back. Before we go any further, pause for just a second, because what Naomi does in the next few minutes will set off a chain of events that reaches back 5 years, down into the dark rock beneath the valley floor, and straight into the heart of a secret that powerful men buried alongside someone she loved. There is a boy out there in the dark. He is 7 years old. He does not speak, and around his neck, he wears a crystal pendant that contains a truth so dangerous that by sunrise, hundreds of armed men will be surrounding this ranch to make sure it never reaches daylight. Think about that. Think about what it means to open a door in the middle of the night because you heard a child cry, and how an act that simple can be the one thing a corrupt empire cannot survive. If you have ever felt that the people who were supposed to protect you were the very ones hiding something from you, this story is for you. Leave a comment below with your city. And if stories like this speak to something real in you, hit like and subscribe, because we are just getting started. Now, back to Naomi. The Whispering Ridge Valley does not appear on most tourist maps. It sits in a fold of the Arizona high desert that seems almost deliberate in its concealment, flanked on 3 sides by canyon walls that rise 200 feet before leveling into flat mesa scrubland, accessible by a single unpaved road that turns to river during monsoon season and turns to dust the other 10 months of the year. The people who live there stay because leaving requires a kind of effort that, over time, starts to feel less like a choice and more like an admission of defeat. Naomi Vance had been born in the valley. She had left twice, once for college in Flagstaff, where she trained as a radio communications specialist, and once for a brief and difficult marriage to a man who loved the idea of remoteness until the reality of it wore him hollow. Both times the valley pulled her back, not with romance, not with warmth, just with the particular gravity of a place that holds your bones. She was 50 years old. Her hair had gone gray at the temples in the year after the disappearance, and she had let it keep going until now it was the color of the canyon walls at dawn, that pale, weathered silver that looks almost luminous in certain light. She was not tall, but she was built with the compact stillness of someone who had learned early that the desert rewards patience and punishes urgency. Her hands were strong. Her eyes were the color of creek shale, and they moved with the quiet precision of someone who had spent decades listening to the world instead of talking over it. The Vance family ranch, officially, legally, historically named the Ridge Break, had been in her family for 4 generations. Her great-grandmother had homesteaded it in the early part of the last century, and every generation since had made some peace with its demands. 400 acres of red earth, 2 cistern wells, a main house built of stone and timber, a barn, 3 outbuildings, and a radio tower that her father had erected in the 1970s and that Naomi had upgraded twice over the years, keeping the equipment operational long after the need had faded. She kept it because some habits lived deeper than logic. After her years as a civilian radio operator for Cochise County Emergency Services, years she was good at, years she had been proud of, Naomi had returned to the ranch full-time following the event that split her life cleanly into before and after. Her daughter, Clara, had been 15 when she went into the valley for what was supposed to be a 2-hour evening trail walk. It was the kind of thing Clara had done dozens of times. She knew the trails. She had a headlamp, a water bottle, and a phone with full signal. She had said she'd be back by 8. By 9, Naomi had called twice and gotten voicemail. By 10, she had told herself not to panic. By 11, she was standing at the front door with her keys in her hand, and something, she would never be able to explain what, had stopped her. Not fear, not reason, some terrible paralysis that she had dressed up in the costume of calm. She had told herself Clara was probably sitting on a rock somewhere watching the stars and had forgotten to charge her phone. She had told herself she was overreacting. She had gone to bed. In the morning, Clara was gone. The search took 11 days. At the end of it, there was no body, no phone, no explanation. Only a section of trail near the eastern canyon wall that showed signs of a minor ground collapse. The official report noted a probable sinkhole formation consistent with natural geological activity. The case went cold within 6 months. The sheriff at the time, a man named Clifton Vance, no relation, a coincidence of naming that the valley seemed to find darkly amusing, had conducted the investigation himself. He had been thorough on paper, efficient. He had expressed condolences with the flat competence of someone who had practiced them. Naomi had not believed him then. She believed him even less now. She had spent the 5 years since that night in a particular kind of hell. Not the loud, visible kind, but the quiet, corrosive kind that hides behind functionality. She ran the ranch. She maintained her equipment. She listened to radio frequencies in the evenings with the patient. Unspoken hope of someone who knows intellectually that hope has expired but cannot stop the body from hoping anyway. She had stopped apologizing for this, even to herself. Tonight had been like every other night, until the monitor crackled, and the sound that came through it turned her blood to ice water. The barn monitor was an old setup, a basic audio feed she'd rigged years ago to keep tabs on the horses without having to make the walk every hour. It was sensitive, picking up everything within 40 feet of the south fence line. Coyotes, wind, the horses shifting in their stalls. Not this. The crying was ragged and desperate, the sound of someone who had been crying for a long time and had passed through fear into something past it. Not theatrical, not searching for help in the crying as signal sense. Just the raw biological function of a body overwhelmed, pouring itself out into the dark. A child, small, exhausted. Naomi did not hesitate. She pulled on her boots at the door without sitting down, a muscle memory move that told you everything about how many times she had made urgent exits from this house. She grabbed the orange emergency flare from the shelf by the door, a marine-grade signal flare, not the cheap roadside kind, and she went out into the dark without a second thought, without calling anyone, without waiting for a reason. The night was enormous. The canyon walls blocked out the horizon on 3 sides, and the sky above Whispering Ridge was the kind of darkness that cities forget is possible, thick with stars, no moon yet. The Milky Way laid across it like ash from a fire no one could name. The air was cold with the sharp mineral cold of high desert nights, and her breath came out in small pale flags ahead of her. She reached the south fence in 90 seconds. The flare lit. Orange light exploded across the scrub, and there, pressed against the outside of the fence post, huddled into the smallest possible version of himself, was a boy. He was tiny. That was the first thing the flare showed her. Not his face, not the strange jacket, not any of the details she would catalog later. Just his size. He was genuinely small, the kind of small that makes the world around a child look aggressive and oversized, and he had folded himself against the fence post in the posture of something that had stopped expecting rescue and was simply waiting for whatever came next. Naomi killed the flare down to its minimum and crouched. She did not call out to him. She did not ask if he was all right. She could see he wasn't, and the question would have been for her benefit, not his. She just got low, put herself at his level, and waited. He was wearing a jacket that was 3 sizes too large. Even in the dimming orange light, she could see that clearly. It hung off his shoulders, swallowed his hands, dragged at the hem to his knees. It was a strange garment, not canvas, not denim, not any ranch or work fabric she recognized. Something technical, synthetic, with small raised seams and what looked like tab connectors along the collar. And on the left chest, in white stenciling, a number, 7, Echo 14. His hair was dark and matted with something, sweat, or worse. And his face, when he finally looked up, was the face of a child who had been terrified for so long that the terror had become the baseline condition and not the event. He didn't speak. He looked at her with eyes that were too old for his face, too steady for someone who had been crying that hard 30 seconds ago. 7 years old, maybe. Small even for that. He had stopped crying the moment the light appeared. He was watching her the way a deer watches, not in panic, just in total stillness, measuring whether this was predator or not. Naomi sat down in the dirt. She set the flare to one side and put her hands on her knees, visible, open. She did not reach for him. She did not stand up or loom. She just sat there in the cold desert dark, 2 feet away from a child who had appeared out of nowhere, and waited. After a long moment, he moved. Not toward her, not yet. He shifted his weight off the fence post and turned fully to face her. And she saw it then, in the low glow, the pendant. It hung from a cord around his neck, resting just below his collarbone. A geode, a small split crystal, the interior violet and silver, the kind of formation that takes thousands of years and looks like the inside of a star. Even in the failing flare light, it had a quality that was almost electric. It caught the orange and held it. She looked at him. He looked at her. She said, gently, one word, come. Not a question, not an order, just an opening. He stood. He walked through the gate. She unlatched, moving past her with the deliberate step of a child making a choice. And she followed him back toward the house, keeping pace behind him, watching the darkness around them both. Inside, she turned the kitchen lights on low. She put a glass of water on the table and a piece of bread beside it, neither of which she made a production of, just set them down like they'd been there already. He sat in the chair she pulled out for him and drank the entire glass of water without stopping. Then he sat with the pendant held between both palms, not fidgeting, not crying, just present. She filled the glass again. She studied the jacket without touching it. Up close, the material was smoother than she'd thought, with microperforations along the sides in a deliberate pattern. Not wear, not damage, but design. The number 7, Echo 14 was stenciled in high-contrast paint that had the look of industrial marking. The tab connectors at the collar were some kind of interface port she didn't have a name for. Someone had put that jacket on this child. Someone with resources. Someone who used numbers instead of names. She looked at the boy. He was looking at her pendant shelf, a small collection she kept above the kitchen doorway. Family pieces mostly, a turquoise BOLO that had been her father's, a small silver cross from her grandmother. He was looking at them with an expression that was not curiosity exactly. Recognition, maybe, like someone seeing something from home in an unfamiliar country. She said, quietly, "What's your name?" He didn't answer. Not in the way of a child being stubborn or shy. In the way of a child for whom the mechanism of answering was simply unavailable. He heard her. He looked at her directly when she spoke. But no sound came. She nodded slowly. She pointed at herself. Naomi. He watched. She pointed at him. He looked down at the crystal pendant in his hands. Then he looked back up at her with an expression so specific she would never be able to describe it adequately later. It was the expression of someone who had been waiting a very long time to be seen. He touched his chest with 2 fingers. She understood. Logan, she said. It wasn't a question. She didn't know where it came from. It just arrived, the way some things do in the quiet. Something in his face shifted. The smallest possible confirmation. She got him a blanket. She put it around his shoulders and sat across from him at the kitchen table. The barn monitor was quiet now. The house was still. Outside, the desert had gone back to its nighttime business. The distant bark of a coyote, the wind moving through the Ocotillo, the sound of the valley breathing. She let him sit until his eyes started to close. She made up the spare bedroom with the quilt her mother had sewn and left the nightlight on. She stood in the doorway until his breathing slowed to the long, even rhythm of exhausted sleep. Then she went back to the kitchen, sat down at her table, and looked at the barn monitor, at the dark screen, at the quiet house around her. Something was very wrong. She didn't know what yet, but she had spent enough years reading signals to know when she was in the middle of one. She did not sleep. She watched the night outside her window and waited for morning to explain itself. The first sound came at 5:47 a.m. Naomi had been at the kitchen table for 5 hours. She had not turned on the radio. She had not called anyone. She had sat with the silence and the monitor and the knowledge that something was wrong, trying to build a shape out of the darkness. What she heard at 5:47 was not an alarm, not a gunshot, not any of the sounds that announce crisis in the obvious ways. It was an engine. A single engine, distant, coming down the valley road from the north. She heard it the way she heard everything out here. Not immediately as a fact, but as a feeling first, a low vibration at the edge of perception that her nervous system logged before her brain did. She stood and moved to the east-facing window. Headlights, a half-mile up the road. She breathed. One truck, early morning. Could be anything. A rancher headed to Benson for supplies. A utility crew. She had made herself go through the reasonable list when the second set of headlights appeared behind the first, then the third. Then, from the south, the direction with no road, a sound that was not an engine at all, but something she had not heard since her time in emergency services. The low, organized percussion of horses moving together. Many horses, moving with the coordinated intention of horses that had been told where to go and had been told with authority. She pressed her face to the glass. The sky was graying now. The canyon walls were emerging from black into their deep red, and she could see, along the northern ridge line, silhouettes. Riders, too many to count in that light, arrayed along the ridge in a line that stretched further than she could track in either direction. The floor lurched under her, not physically, but the inner floor of her understanding of what morning was supposed to be. It lurched with the particular vertigo of suddenly grasping the scale of something that had been invisible a moment before. She had been watching for threats the size of a single truck. This was not that. This was not a single truck. She went to Logan's room. He was still asleep. She put her hand gently on his shoulder, and he woke immediately, not with the groggy confusion of normal children, but with the snapping alertness of someone accustomed to waking up to bad situations. He sat upright. He looked at her face. She kept her expression as steady as she could manage. But he read something anyway, because he was a child who had learned to read faces the way other children learn to read books. And he pulled the pendant from his chest and held it tight in both fists. "Stay here," she told him. "Stay quiet, away from windows." She turned back to the east window just as the sun crested the canyon rim. The light came in horizontal and gold, the way it does in the desert when it arrives at that angle. Not warming, not gentle, but illuminating. Clinical. It showed her everything. The valley was full. There were trucks on the north road, 4 of them now, large body vehicles with equipment racks and antenna clusters that she recognized immediately as tactical communications gear. There were riders on the southern approach, at least 40 on that side alone, arranged in a crescent formation with the ranch at its center point. On the western mesa, above the old water line, there were 2 flatbed vehicles with what appeared to be mounted equipment she couldn't identify at this distance. And then the speakers activated. The sound was enormous. The canyon walls caught it and threw it back, doubled, tripled. The way Whispering Ridge amplified everything. She had grown up knowing this, had used it herself once, had never heard it weaponized until now. The voice was flat, professional. The voice of a man who had given this speech before and had not felt it any of the times. "Naomi Vance, you are harboring an individual classified under Federal Health Protocol 7 Bravo. This individual is a confirmed carrier of an unidentified biological agent. You are required by emergency statute to release the individual and vacate the premises immediately. Your cooperation will result in full preservation of your property. Non-compliance will result in emergency demolition orders under National Quarantine Authority. You have 10 minutes to comply. Place your house keys on the outside windowsill and exit through the north gate." The echo of his voice rolled back and forth between the canyon walls, diminishing in rings, each reflection smaller and more hollow than the last, until the valley was silent again. Naomi stood very still. She knew that voice. She had known it for 30 years. It had delivered her daughter's death report to her across a desk with the same professional flatness. Clifton Vance, the commandante. She turned and looked at the kitchen, at the table where Logan had sat, at the barn monitor, at her radio equipment in the back room, at the door with its iron bolt. 10 minutes. She walked to the back room and sat down in front of her equipment. Her hands were completely steady. That was the strangest part. She had been waiting 5 years for something to happen that would make sense of the thing that had broken her. And now that it was here, she felt less like panicking and more like finally arriving at the thing she had been braced for all along. She turned on the transmitter. Not to broadcast. Not yet. To listen. The voice came back at the 8-minute mark. "Naomi Vance, this is your final advisory. The minor in your custody has been designated a public health risk under emergency protocols. He is not safe to be near. He is not what he appears to be. You have 2 minutes remaining." She listened to this from the back room, watching the needle on her frequency monitor, running a passive scan across the tactical bands. What she found there was interesting. They were on 3 frequencies. The first was obvious. The loudspeaker broadcast, civilian band, performative. The second was an encrypted tactical channel she could detect, but not decode. The third, and most interesting, was a commercial mining relay frequency, specifically the relay band used by deep-bore survey operations. She had learned that band years ago when a mining survey team had passed through the valley and had needed temporary communication support. It was an unusual choice for a law enforcement operation. It was not a law enforcement operation. She had known that, in some pre-verbal layer of herself, since the first moment she heard the word quarantine from his voice. Because Clifton Vance was not a health official. He was not a federal agent. He was the man who controlled what happened in this valley. And he had controlled it for a long time by making sure the people who might have asked questions were either absorbed into his apparatus or removed from it. Her daughter had been removed from it. She stopped that thought before it went all the way through. She could not afford it right now. From the spare room, a creak, Logan had moved to the doorway. He stood there in the oversized jacket with the blanket still around his shoulders, holding the pendant and watching her. She held up one finger. Wait. And he leaned against the door frame and waited. She turned back to the equipment. The tactical radio chatter she was picking up in fragments, decoding imperfectly, was giving her pieces. She caught the word perimeter 3 times. She caught the word package once, which was not how you referred to a sick child, but was very specifically how you referred to something with value. She caught what sounded like grid coordinates for 2 positions on the eastern canyon wall, positions directly above her radio antenna array. They knew about the antennas, which meant someone had briefed them on the property in detail, which meant this had been prepared for, not improvised around an overnight development, prepared in advance, the way you prepare for a specific contingency that you have been expecting. They had been waiting for the boy to end up here. The thought landed with strange weight. She turned it over. Whispering Ridge Valley's acoustics were famous locally. Everyone who grew up here knew that sounds traveled here with impossible fidelity, that a whisper on the canyon floor could be heard clearly from half a mile in the right atmospheric conditions. If someone had wanted a child's cry to be heard at a specific location, if someone had released a child near the canyon, at midnight, knowing the acoustic properties of the terrain. She looked at Logan. He was watching her face with that same uncanny attentiveness. She said, carefully, "Were they going to come here anyway?" He didn't answer, but his hand tightened on the pendant. She didn't push it. Instead, she looked at the jacket, at the interface connectors at the collar, at the number 7, Echo 14. She had been treating that number as an identifier, a catalog number, the kind of dehumanizing label institutional systems use. But she was an old radio operator. She knew that Echo was the NATO phonetic alphabet designation for the letter E. And in her emergency services training, the prefix 7E had a specific meaning in certain federal communication protocols. 7 Echo meant active signal carrier. She felt the hairs on her arms rise. She said, "Logan, your pendant. Can I see it?" He looked at her for a long moment. Then he lifted the cord over his head and held it out. She took it with both hands, carefully, and brought it to her desk lamp. Up close, the geode crystal was extraordinary, a small cathedral of violet and silver, mathematically perfect in its internal structure. But it was the base of the pendant, the raw stone underside of the geode, that stopped her breath. Microengraving, dense and precise, the kind of mark that needed magnification to read. She got her loupe from the equipment drawer and held it up. The markings were frequency codes. Not natural, not decorative, specific, technical, calibrated, the kind of documentation you made when you needed to record acoustic data in a format that couldn't be electronically wiped or remotely deleted. Physical inscription, permanent. Someone had encoded a series of precise acoustic frequencies into the base of this crystal, and the crystal's own geometric structure would function as a physical resonator for those specific frequencies. It was the most extraordinary piece of evidence she had ever held, because she recognized the format. Seismic acoustic signatures, specifically, the kind produced by subsurface collapse events. Deep-bore mining operations generated these signatures as a byproduct, and regulatory agencies sometimes required them to be recorded and submitted as evidence of operational impact. She had seen similar data in the public records related to the investigation into Clara's disappearance, where it had been entered as exhibit material and then quietly, efficiently removed. She understood, in that moment, what Logan was carrying, and she understood what Clifton Vance would do to retrieve it. The loudspeaker crackled to life outside. "Time has expired. We are entering the property. Any resistance will be treated as obstruction under emergency statute. Stand down and you will not be harmed." She heard, Beneath that voice, something new. The sound of boots on gravel, close. North fence line, 30 feet. She looked at Logan. He looked back at her. She said, "We're going to be okay." And she was startled by how completely she meant it. She bolted the iron door. The sound of them moving around the property's perimeter was systematic, not rushed. The pace of people who believed they had all the time they needed because they controlled the exits. Naomi stayed at her equipment. She was building a picture in her mind, the way she used to build pictures in her emergency services days, integrating signals, mapping positions, constructing a clear operational image from partial data. She had been good at this. She had been very good at this. Logan had moved to sit beside her desk. He had accepted the proximity to the radio equipment without any sign of discomfort, which told her he was familiar with this kind of environment. He was watching the equipment with an expression that was not a child watching an adult at work, but something more focused, recognition, again, like someone in a foreign country who has suddenly heard their own language spoken. She pointed to the frequency display. She said, quietly, "Do you know what this is?" He nodded. She felt the back of her neck go cold. A 7-year-old who recognized radio frequency monitoring equipment. She filed that away and kept moving. She pulled the loop from the desk and held it over the pendant base again, this time writing down the frequency sequences she could read. 5 distinct signatures, each one labeled in a notation system she recognized as modified USGS seismic coding, the same format used to record underground structural events. Date stamps embedded in the notation. She could not read all of them without better magnification, but she could read 2. The first date stamp corresponded to a period 14 months before Clara's disappearance. The second date stamp was the exact date of Clara's disappearance. She set the loop down on the desk with complete precision and sat for a moment with her hands flat on the surface. A controlled collapse, not a natural sinkhole. A deliberate subsurface detonation at a depth consistent with mining operations. The kind of event that would produce a precisely localized ground failure. Exactly the kind of ground failure that had been recorded near the section of trail where Clara's phone had last pinged. Her hands were shaking. She noticed this the way you notice weather from inside a building, with a kind of distance. She said, to no one in particular, very quietly, "They did it on purpose." Logan reached over and placed his small hand over hers. She looked at him, at his face, at those old eyes in a child's face. She said, "Were you there? Underground?" He held the pendant. He pressed it to his sternum. She said, "The people who had you, they used you to test the sounds, the frequencies." He held the pendant tighter. She said, "You were in the caverns." Something moved across his face. Not grief exactly, not in the adult sense, but its precursor. The look of a body remembering something the mind is still trying to organize. She said, "How did you get out?" He looked at his left wrist. She followed his eyes and for the first time noticed, beneath the oversized sleeve of the jacket, something she had missed before. A thin pale scar, clean and horizontal, the kind left by a restraint worn for a long time. He pulled the sleeve up slightly and showed her 2 small ports under the skin, sealed with medical-grade adhesive, the kind of subcutaneous interface used in. She did not want to complete this thought, but she completed it anyway. Experimental monitoring programs. Her stomach dropped. This was not a missing child. This was a child who had been inside something institutional and organized and completely illegal. Something that had been running for long enough to build infrastructure, to embed monitoring hardware in a 7-year-old, to construct an elaborate cover story about biological contamination and invoke emergency quarantine protocols at 6 in the morning to retrieve one small boy from one woman's kitchen. She said, "Logan, the people outside, do they know what's in the pendant?" He nodded. She said, "That's why they want you back." He nodded again. She breathed. Then she said, more to herself than to him, "They're not going to get you." She turned back to her equipment and started thinking about what she had that they didn't. The first window went at 7:12 a.m. Not broken, not yet, but she heard the sound of something pressed against the glass in the south-facing utility room, and she knew what that was. They were attaching shielded contact points to the exterior frames, preparing for the magnetic pulse discharge that would knock out the electrical systems, the lighting, the communications, the iron lock mechanisms on the doors. She had 20 minutes, maybe less. She moved fast, but not frantically. From the storage room, she pulled the manual generator, a hand crank unit her father had installed 40 years ago, and she had maintained out of the same stubbornness that kept the radio tower operational. She ran its output cable directly to her communications board, bypassing the main electrical panel entirely. If they burned the house circuits, the equipment would stay live on manual power. She glanced at Logan. He had moved to the kitchen doorway and was watching her with that steady attention. She pointed up. He followed her finger to the ceiling, to the hatch that led to the fortified storage loft her great-grandmother had built during a period of regional violence that people out here didn't discuss much with strangers. He nodded. She came back to the desk and began connecting the pendant. She had to improvise. The geode crystal was not electronic hardware. It had no wires, no ports, no standard interface. But it was a resonator. And she had, on her equipment shelf, an acoustic coupler she had used years ago for analog signal work, a small transducer pad that could read physical vibrations and convert them to electronic signal. She had to work by touch more than sight in some of the connections, but her hands knew this equipment the way musicians know their instruments. After 4 minutes, she had the pendant resting in the coupler cradle, with an output lead running to her frequency analyzer. She activated the analyzer. For a moment, nothing. Then the display came alive. 5 waveforms, each one distinct, each one carrying the structural signature of a subsurface acoustic event. The analyzer was showing her what the crystal had been recording, not just the dates, but the full acoustic profiles. The waveforms were dense with data, complex, and she did not have time to read them fully. But at the bottom of the 4th waveform, she saw something that was not geological data. It was voice data, embedded in the seismic signal. At a subfrequency humans don't consciously register, someone had overlaid an audio recording. It was encrypted in the baseline noise of the geological signature, hidden there the way intelligence services hid messages in plain sight during the Cold War, camouflaged as something it wasn't. But it was there. A voice track. Her hands were not steady anymore. She ran the demixing filter. It was a basic function on her old equipment, designed for separating overlapping broadcast signals. Not forensic audio recovery, but the principles were the same, and she had years of practice with the subtler applications of her tools. The waveform resolved. Static, then breath, then a voice she had not heard in 5 years. It said, "Mom, if you're hearing this." She stopped breathing entirely. "They told me I had to record everything. I don't know why. They said it was for the study. I'm going to try to leave something real in here. I'm okay. I want you to know I'm okay right now. I found a boy. His name is..." The signal broke. Static consumed it. And she sat there in her kitchen with her hand pressed to her mouth and the sound of boots moving on gravel outside and the canyon wall amplifying every sound into something vast and merciless. Claire's voice, from inside the caverns, from 5 years ago, recorded on the pendant of a boy she had carried out of the dark. She heard, from outside, the loudspeaker, "We are entering the premises in 5 minutes. Last opportunity to comply." She looked up at the hatch, at Logan, who was standing at the foot of the ladder, watching her. She said, and her voice was the steadiest it had been in 5 years, "Get up the ladder. Go all the way to the back corner. There's a toolbox. Stay beside it." He went. She stood at her equipment for 10 more seconds, long enough to start the frequency broadcast on full power, aimed at the tactical channels, broadcasting the pendant data in the clear. Then she went up the ladder and pulled it up behind her. The loft was low-ceilinged and smelled of old timber and machine oil and something sweeter underneath, cedar, from the old chest where her grandmother had kept her things. Naomi pulled the hatch cover closed. In the darkness, she could hear Logan breathing, steady and quiet, in the back corner by the toolbox, just where she'd told him to go. She felt her way to the small folding table she knew was against the north wall and sat on the floor beside it, her back against the wall, her legs out in front of her. Below, she heard the first impact against the south window frame. A sharp, contained burst, electrical, not explosive. The lights went out. The hum of the equipment died. Through the floorboards, she felt the death of the main panel, every circuit in the house going to zero simultaneously. Then, after a pause, the sound of boots inside the house. She counted footsteps, 3 individuals, moving with professional discipline, room by room. She heard them in the kitchen, in the storage room, in the back radio room. She heard the scrape of her equipment being moved, and something in her contracted at that. Years of careful maintenance, of precise calibration, roughly displaced. She breathed through it. The manual generator was still running. She had connected it to the backup transmitter before she came up, setting it to a repeating broadcast on the National Guard emergency frequency. Whether anyone was monitoring that frequency, whether anyone would respond, was not something she could control. She had sent the signal. The rest was beyond her. Logan made a sound, not quite a word, just a small vocalization of attention. She heard him moving toward her. In the dark, she felt his shoulder press against her arm, and she let him stay there. She sat in the darkness above her invaded house and tried to think clearly. The pendant data was broadcasting. If the analysis system had read the voice track the way she thought it had, the transmission included that data too. Clara's voice, embedded in the geological evidence, bouncing off the canyon walls and reaching whatever receiver might be listening. She did not know if that would be enough. She did not know if anyone outside this valley would hear it in time. What she did know was that below her, men employed by the operation that had killed her daughter were walking through her house. She had choices. She could call out, identify herself, come down from the loft and stand in front of them and demand to speak to someone with actual federal authority, invoke her rights, invoke the law that Clifton Vance's operation had bent and broken for decades, but that still, in theory, existed as a structure she could appeal to. The law that had failed Clara. The law that had accepted a falsified geological report and closed a case on a missing 15-year-old girl in under 6 months. She ran that option through and let it die. She could stay silent until they found the hatch, which they would, and hope that when they came up, the presence of a child would make them stop. She thought about the word package. She thought about the monitoring ports under Logan's skin. She thought about what kind of organization put medical hardware in a 7-year-old. She ran that option through and let it die too. Or she could fight, but fighting, in the context she was in, did not mean violence. She had no weapon capable of standing against 40 riders and 4 tactical trucks. Fighting meant something else. It meant using the one asset she had that they did not, the valley itself. The acoustic property of Whispering Ridge that had been making sounds enormous for longer than any of the men outside had been alive. The broadcast was running. The pendant data was going out. But data sent on a frequency no one was monitoring was just sound swallowed by distance. She needed to make it impossible to ignore. And she was sitting, directly above her, on the roof access point of the highest gain antenna array in the valley. She thought about Clara. Not the absence of Clara, which was what she usually thought about. The hole in the world shaped like her daughter, the negative space that her mind kept falling into. She thought about what Clara's voice had said. I found a boy. She thought about what that meant. She thought about a 15-year-old girl in an underground facility, methodical enough to embed a message in a seismic recording, careful enough to encode it in a way that would survive years of dormancy, brave enough to still be thinking about other people when she was the one in the dark. She thought about what she owed that girl. She thought about Logan, pressed against her arm in the darkness, his hand now around hers, small and cold and trusting in the way that only happens when someone has no other choice but to trust and makes the choice anyway. He had been released. She understood that now, the way you understand things that you've been building toward without knowing it. He had been released into the valley intentionally. The acoustic signature of a child's cry amplified by the canyon walls to reach the one person in this region with the equipment and the history to decode the pendant. She did not know if this had been planned by someone protecting him or by some coincidence of physics and desperation. It didn't matter. He was here. The pendant was here. The signal was going out. And she was about to make a choice that she knew, very clearly, she could not unmake. She put her mouth close to Logan's ear and said, I need you to stay exactly here. No matter what you hear. Can you do that? His hand squeezed hers once. She said, one more thing. Your jacket, those ports at the collar. Are they active? Is anyone tracking through them? He reached up and felt the collar ports. He shook his head once. She said, you're sure? He nodded. She breathed. Then she said, okay. She started moving toward the roof access. She heard him before she saw him. The sound of the axe against the loft hatch was methodical. 3 blows, spaced with the patience of someone who had no doubt about the outcome. The hatch was old, but it was solid, thick pine planking with iron corner brackets, and it held through the 4th blow and the 5th. Naomi was already at the roof access by then, the small square hatch above the northeast corner of the loft. She pushed it open and climbed out into the full morning light, and the world was enormous. From the roof, Whispering Ridge Valley opened in every direction. The canyon walls rose red and gold in the early sun. The valley floor below her was still filled with the operation. Trucks, riders, the disciplined geometry of a force that believed itself in control. She could see, from up here, how complete it was. Every road, every approach, every exit point covered. She could also see, from up here, the antenna array. Her father's original tower was 30 feet to the north, but the real power was in the lateral array, 4 high-gain directional antennas positioned along the roof's ridge line, aimed at the canyon walls with the specific intention of using Whispering Ridge's acoustic geometry to their maximum advantage. Her father had built this for emergency broadcasts. She had maintained it and upgraded it for reasons she had only half admitted to herself. She moved across the roof on her hands and knees, keeping low. The axe kept working at the hatch below. She reached the junction box and opened it. The manual generator was running. She could feel the vibration through the roof decking, hear the clean hum of it below the noise of the braking hatch. She had about 4 minutes before they came through. She connected the pendant transmitter output to the directional array. The pendant was still in the acoustic coupler downstairs, connected to the backup transmitter, broadcasting on its repeating loop. What she was doing now was rerouting that signal, pulling it out of the quiet, precise emergency frequency she'd aimed it at earlier, and instead routing it through the full power of the directional array aimed at the canyon walls. Whispering Ridge was famous for its acoustics. The canyon walls were essentially perfect acoustic reflectors, angled, curved slightly, made of a sandstone density that returned sound without absorbing it. Sound introduced at the right frequency from the right position didn't just echo. It built. It multiplied. It became, under the right conditions, something that could rattle windows and disturb horses and make standing near the canyon walls physically disorienting. She was about to find out what happened when you introduced 5 calibrated seismic frequency signatures through a high-power directional array into that system. The hatch below her exploded open. She flipped the junction box switch to maximum output. For a moment, there was nothing, just the sound of someone pulling themselves up through the hatch behind her. Then the canyon spoke. The frequencies hit the walls, and the walls answered. And what came back was not sound as she knew it. It was pressure. It was a resonance that bypassed the ear and hit somewhere deeper, in the chest, in the inner ear's vestibular system, in the place behind the eyes where balance lives. It was not painful, exactly, but it was overwhelming, the kind of overwhelming that makes the body insist on stopping, on crouching, on holding still until whatever was happening stopped happening. Below her, she heard the horses. The horses heard it before the men did, or felt it, rather, the way animals feel things before humans catalog them. She heard the controlled precision of the mounted perimeter dissolve into sudden disorder. Horses refusing commands, sidling, the sharp clatter of hooves on rock as animals broke from their positions. Voices started, not orders now, but something less organized. Confusion moving through the ranks like a wave. On the roof behind her, she heard a man say something in a tone that was not threatening anymore. She did not look back. She held the junction switch and kept the array running and watched the valley below her come apart at its organized seams. Riders moving wrong, trucks repositioning without apparent reason, the careful geometry of the siege dissolving into a pattern that looked, from up here, like a drawing being erased. And then, distant at first, then suddenly close, the way helicopters announced themselves, the sound of rotors. Not 1, 3, coming in from the northeast, following the valley floor at low altitude, their navigation lights still on in the early morning light, the green and white markings of National Guard aviation. She closed her eyes for 1 second. The transmission had been received. Getting down from the roof was harder than getting up. Her arms were shaking, the specific shake of adrenaline cycling out of a body that had been running on pure voltage for the last 2 hours. She moved carefully, methodically, every motion deliberate, because this was not the time to fall. The roof access dropped her back into the loft. Clifton Vance was standing 5 feet from the open hatch with an axe in his hand and a look on his face that she had never seen there before. Not the flat professional competence, not the managed authority, something rawer, something that recognized what had just happened and was still working out what to do with the information. He was a big man, older than she remembered from the close-up detail of his face. The last 5 years had done something to him that she found, unexpectedly, satisfying to witness. His jaw was tight. His eyes were moving fast, reading the room, calculating. She came down from the access ladder and stood between him and Logan. Logan was in the back corner where she'd left him. He had not moved. He was holding the blanket around his shoulders, and the pendant was gone. She'd taken it, and he was watching Clifton Vance with an expression of total, absolute stillness. Vance said, "Give me the boy." His voice was completely even. That was the most frightening thing about him. She had always thought, not the authority, but the evenness. The sense that he had decided, somewhere along the way, not to feel the things his actions required. She said, "The helicopters are landing." He said, "The boy?" She said, "You killed my daughter." The words were not accusatory. They were declarative. She said them the way you say the name of something you have finally identified, without drama, without performance, with the quiet completion of a sentence that had been waiting years to be finished. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "She shouldn't have been down there." She breathed. He said, "It wasn't the plan." She said, "Tell that to the federal agents who are walking through my house right now." His jaw moved. Below them, through the floor, she could hear boots. More boots than before, moving with a different authority than the first wave. She heard voices she didn't recognize calling clearance on rooms, the specific shorthand of federal tactical teams. She heard someone, distant, reciting rights in a flat professional voice. Vance looked at the axe in his hand as if he'd forgotten it was there. She said, "Put it down." He looked at Logan. He looked at her. And for a moment she saw, beneath the evenness, the thing that the evenness had been covering. Not guilt, because she didn't think he had the capacity for it, but something adjacent to it. The look of a man who had always believed the cost was someone else's to pay, and was beginning to understand that the accounting had caught up. He set the axe on the floor. 2 federal agents came through the loft hatch 30 seconds later. They let her stay in the loft while they processed the scene below. One of the agents, a woman, younger than Naomi, with the specific competence of someone who had been briefed thoroughly before arrival, came up with a water bottle and a blanket and said very little, which Naomi appreciated more than she could articulate. Logan had not moved from his corner. When the noise below settled, the voices organizing into the systematic language of an operation switching from tactical to procedural, Naomi went to him. She sat beside him on the loft floor, her back against the same beam, and for a while neither of them said anything. Then he moved. He reached into the right pocket of the oversized jacket with the deliberate care of someone handling something precious, the particular care of a child who has been responsible for something important for a long time and is only now in a position to release that responsibility. He pulled his hand out. He was holding a watch, a small wristwatch, leather strap, cracked with age and whatever conditions had been part of its recent life. He held it out toward her on his open palm, both hands flat beneath it, the gesture of an offering rather than a gift. She looked at it. Her vision was perfect. She was not someone who needed to squint or bring things close in normal circumstances. But her eyes were not entirely clear right now, and so it took her a moment longer than it might have to read what was engraved on the back of the watch case. She read it 3 times. Clara R. Vance, with love. It had been her daughter's 16th birthday present. She had ordered it from a catalog, spent more than she should have, and written her own instruction for the engraver. She had wrapped it and left it on the kitchen table for the morning, and the morning after that morning had been the morning she woke up and Clara was not there and the watch was never given. She had not known what happened to it. She had not allowed herself to think about it too specifically, because the specific thoughts were the ones that undid her. But Clara had been alive after the collapse. Clara had found it, or had it with her, had been wearing it, had kept it in those underground spaces where she'd made her recordings and found Logan and kept her mind sharp enough to hide evidence in geological data. Clara had given it to Logan to carry out. She understood this with total clarity, not as inference, not as hope, as fact. Clara had given it to Logan because Clara had known, or hoped, or trusted that this small boy would eventually reach someone who would understand what he was carrying. That had been Clara's faith in the world, even from inside the dark, that sending the evidence out, sending Logan out, would eventually reach someone. It had reached her mother. She closed her hand around the watch and pressed it to her chest, and she sat in the broken loft of her broken house, and she allowed herself to cry for the first time in 5 years without shame. Not the muffled, suppressed crying of someone managing a grief they won't give full permission to. The full, open, terrible crying of someone who has been handed back something they thought was gone forever, and whose body finally understands that the waiting is over. Logan put his hand on her arm. She looked at him through everything that was in her eyes. He was not uncomfortable with her grief. He sat with it the way he sat with most things, with the patience of someone who had learned very early that some things simply had to be felt all the way through before anything else was possible. She said, when she could speak, "Thank you." He looked at her steadily. She said, "She found you." He pressed his hand once more to his chest, the same gesture he had made the first night. She understood. He had been hers, in whatever way the underground dark allows the formation of the bonds that form there. Clara had kept him safe until she couldn't anymore. And then she had sent him out, wrapped in evidence, aimed at the one frequency that would find the right person. She said, quietly, she was very brave. He nodded. She said, "So were you." The federal team lead found her 20 minutes later, while she was still in the loft, and told her what she needed to know in the compressed, precise language of someone who had been doing this long enough to know what civilians needed to hear and in what order. Clifton Vance was in custody. The commandante, who had controlled the valley for 30 years with the practiced impunity of someone who had always been able to make problems disappear, was at that moment being processed by federal agents who had been, as it turned out, building a parallel investigation for 14 months. The pendant data, transmitted via Naomi's array and received by a federal monitoring station in Tucson that had been watching this region's tactical frequencies after an anonymous tip, had been the final piece of a file that was already thick. They had enough, the agent told her. More than enough. She nodded. She asked about the people in the operation who were not Vance, the riders, the drivers, the people who had followed orders while knowing what the orders protected. The agent's face told her that this was the complicated part. That accountability for the people in the middle was the part that took longer and went further than any single case resolution. She nodded again. She understood complicated. She had been living inside it for 5 years. Then the agent told her the other thing. The underground facility, she said, had been partially operational as recently as 3 weeks ago. The federal team was moving into it now. They expected to recover documentation and equipment. They also expected, and here the agent paused, for the first time, in the way of someone choosing words carefully, to recover biological evidence that would allow a final determination regarding the fate of individuals listed as missing in connection with the site. Naomi sat very still. She said, "Clara," the agent said, "I can't make you any promises, but I can tell you we're going to look." That was the right thing to say. Not a false comfort, not a wall of procedure, just the truth of what was possible, delivered without flinching. Naomi said, "I know she didn't make it." She held the watch. She said, "I know, but I need to bring her home." The agent said, "Then we'll bring her home." Logan was at Naomi's side. He had come from his corner while the agent was talking, moving silently across the loft floor, and he was standing with his shoulder pressed against Naomi's arm again, and he did not look like a child waiting for adult business to be concluded. He looked like someone who had already done his part and was now simply present, which was all he had to offer and was not small. By noon, the valley was a different kind of full, not the ordered, armed, purposeful crowding of the early morning. Federal vehicles now, marked and official, moving with the slower patience of people gathering evidence rather than controlling space. The tactical trucks were gone. The riders were gone. The canyon walls, which had amplified the morning's chaos into something that had reached every living thing in a 5-mile radius, now carried only the sounds of wind and work. Naomi and Logan were on the porch. The house was damaged. The south window frame scorched where the magnetic charge had burned through, the loft hatch shattered, several rooms in various stages of disruption. It would take months to restore, and the thought of what that would require did not yet feel manageable. But the porch was intact. The old boards held. The view was unchanged. The view was always unchanged. That was the thing about Whispering Ridge that she had forgotten, or maybe had never fully understood before this morning. It did not care about the human dramas that played out in its floor. The canyon walls had stood for millions of years. They had heard everything. They had amplified everything without judgment. The sounds of violence and the sounds of peace. The sounds of cover-ups and the sounds of their undoing. The cry of a child in the dark and the frequencies that would bring the whole apparatus down. The valley was indifferent in the way that immense things are indifferent. Not cold, not cruel, just vastly larger than the things happening inside it. She had spent 5 years listening to this valley for a voice that never came back. She would never stop thinking about Clara. She understood that clearly, Grief of that particular shape does not resolve. It transforms. It becomes something you carry differently over time, more integrated, less like a wound and more like a scar that still moves when you move, that is still part of you. But the carrying would be different now. It would be weighted with something that the last 5 years had not had. The knowledge of who Clara had been in the dark, what she had done with what she had. She thought about her daughter finding a small, silent boy in an underground space and deciding, in spite of everything, to take care of him. She thought about Clara teaching herself to encode messages in geological data with the practical inventiveness of a person who had decided to keep going. She thought about a 15-year-old girl making choices under impossible conditions that had resulted, 5 years later, in the people responsible being walked out of a canyon in handcuffs. Clara had not survived, but she had not been passive. She had not simply waited for rescue that did not come. She had done the things she could do with the resources she had. She had sent the truth out into the world and trusted the world to eventually hear it. Logan was on the steps, looking out at the valley. He had found, somewhere in the post-crisis processing of the morning, a piece of flat red rock that he was turning over in his hands. Not anxiously, the way he had held the pendant, but with the simple, tactile pleasure of a child who has reached a place where simple tactile pleasure is available again. Naomi looked at him. She thought about what came next. Not the investigation, not the legal proceedings, not the reconstruction of the house. The other next. The domestic, daily next of a ranch that had held one person for 5 years and now held something different. She did not have the language for what Logan was to her. They had known each other for 6 hours. He had not spoken a single word. They had been through the kind of thing that creates a bond that is not like ordinary bonds. Not slow-built, not based on shared history, but crystallized under pressure in the way that certain geological structures form, in conditions extreme enough to force irreversible change. He must have felt her looking, because he turned. She held up the watch. She turned it over in her hand so he could see the back, could see the engraving. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he looked at her. She said, "She would have liked you." He looked back at the valley. She said, "She did like you." Something in his face moved, quiet and deep, the kind of motion that happens below the surface of expression, where the real emotional tectonic work takes place. She said, "I'm not going anywhere. And neither are you. Not until you have somewhere better to go. And I'm not sure somewhere better exists." He turned back to her. His expression was serious, as it almost always was. But there was something underneath the seriousness now that had not been there at midnight, when she found him crying in the dark. Something that was not yet settled, not yet fully what it would eventually become, but that was oriented, pointed in a direction. She extended her hand, not to shake, just open, available. He looked at it for a moment. Then he set the red rock down on the step and put his hand in hers. The valley held them in its ancient, amplifying quiet. The wind moved through the Ocotillo. Far above, on the canyon rim, a red-tailed hawk crossed the edge of the light and banked south and was gone. The sun was climbing now, pouring its flat white heat down on Whispering Ridge the way it had been doing since before any of this was here, before the ranch, before the roads, before the humans with their terrible and sometimes extraordinary capacity for cruelty and for care. Naomi Vance sat on the porch of the damaged house that her great-grandmother had built and held the hand of a boy she had found crying in the dark and looked out at the most beautiful thing she had ever seen, which was the valley in the morning with nothing moving in it except the wind. She thought. She fought all the way to the end. She thought. So did I? She thought. Whatever comes next, I am not facing it alone. The echo of the morning was still settling. Sound takes a long time to die in that valley. Somewhere in the canyon walls, if you listened carefully, if you knew what to hear, the frequencies were still bouncing, still finding their paths, still refusing to be completely still. Some sounds don't disappear. They just wait for the right listener. There is a kind of courage that does not announce itself. It doesn't stand at the front of a crowd or carry a weapon or demand acknowledgement. It sits at a kitchen table at 5 in the morning and decides that a small boy found crying in the dark deserves protection, even when protection costs everything. It climbs a roof in the middle of a siege with shaking hands. It speaks the names of the dead out loud and refuses to let those names be buried. Naomi didn't save the day because she was extraordinary. She saved it because she paid attention, because she stayed, because she chose, at every single point where a choice was available, the harder thing. We built this story together. You stayed with it through every silence and every detonation, and that matters. If this found something real in you, if some part of this valley's echo reached somewhere you recognize, leave a comment below. Tell me where you're watching from. Tell me if you've ever held on to something the world told you to let go of and kept holding anyway. Like this story if it moved you. Share it with someone who needs a reminder that truth, once sent out into the world, tends to eventually arrive. And subscribe, because there are more stories waiting in the silence, and we have a lot more ground to cover.